All right, so in this video, we're going to begin creating the wood material for this Canon asset. Now the file's obviously already been prepared and the bake mesh maps are already available. And this means that we can now focus on the material construction process rather than the project setup or the baking. So for the first pass, the goal isn't to create a perfectly realistic wood material. Instead, what we're aiming for is more of a clear, stylized result that feels readable. Most importantly, it must feel colorful. And even more important than that, it must feel like it's appealing. So the material should show things like wood grain, surface variation, darker grooves, and a sense of form. But it should still fit the simplified style of the asset itself. So before we start painting, it's useful to understand the basic layering approach. Now we're going to build this wood material in stages. So the first stage will be us creating the main base color. And then we're going to add procedural texture variation to break up the surface. And then after that, we will add bump or height information so that the grain has more surface quality. Then we will use things like curvature, occlusion, and darker color variation to help define things like grooves and edges and contact areas. And then finally, we're going to review the results and adjust the strength of the layers so that the wood feels stylized without becoming too noisy or too realistic. Okay, so let's start by creating a full color. Now, I don't want to be working on the metal. I want to be working on the wood. You can choose to either hide the metal or you can keep it visible. It really just depends on whatever your own preference is. So I'm going to create this fill over here. I'm going to label this something like base color. And then if I look under the properties, I want my color channel. The other thing that I'm thinking that I'm also wanting at this point is also a roughness, because I'm wanting to start to create a broad definition for the roughness. Okay. At the moment, what we're seeing when we remove this is the roughness that's been inherited by default through this material that's been applied. But you know, that's not the final roughness value. Okay. I might not want this as shiny. I might want this a little bit dull. The fact remains is that I want to start controlling it over here. So under the base color, I'm enabling the roughness as well. And I'm actually going to just increase this value from 0.3 to something like 0.4. I still want it to be a little bit of shine. I just don't want it to be as shiny as what the default value was. Okay, then we can turn our attention to the color itself. So for this color, what I'm thinking of is I'm wanting something that that is nice and saturated. So something like this, actually. Something that's got like a nice bit of yellow to it as well. Again, I'm looking at the reference and I'm seeing that sort of color, and I'm wanting to preserve that appeal. And not just that, but that vibrance that the color actually has. All right, so something like this I think is a close enough match, and I'm happy with that. What I would advise is that you go ahead and you create a swatch. All right, so that it's just much easier to grab this again in the not too distant future. Okay, so after this base color, the next thing that we can start to look at is we can start developing a wood texture for ourselves. Now, I want to be very clear about this when I say a wood texture, because there's a very particular way I want us to do this. And it's a wood texture that I want to create, and I want to use something called an anchor point. And an anchor point is not something that we have covered so far. But what it allows us to do is it allows us to create something, obviously a material in this case, or some kind of a combination of textures. And then if we give it an anchor point, it means that we can call that group of textures in at various points within our layer stack over here. So it's really useful. It's something, it's like, think of it like this little self-contained network. You create it once, and then you can reference it in at various points. And although it might feel as though it takes extra time in the beginning, it actually ends up saving time, using this process. The other thing that's really useful about it is that if we wanted to change something in relation to that little cluster or that network, we can do so, and it's going to automatically update across the rest of the layer stack. So again, this is about forward thinking, and it's about trying to find ways in which we can work more efficiently and make our work more easily updatable. All right, so to start this process, I'm just going to create a fill layer over here. Let's go ahead and let's label this wood texture. And then I'm going to go ahead and right click. I'm going to say add a black mask. All right, so let's right click on that black mask. And then I'm going to come down, I'm going to say add generator. And let's click on this generator button over here. The one that we are looking for is, we're looking for a Voronoi generator. In fact, what we should do is just erase that prefix out, just so that it shows Voronoi over here. And the version of the Voronoi that we're after is, it's one of these two cubes, and it's going to be the second one over here. Okay, so just go ahead and click on that. And you'll see that what we've now loaded up is this 3D Voronoi fractal. Now, it's great that we are seeing this result over here, but this actually doesn't really help me in trying to adjust the mask and trying to get the result that I'm looking for. So what we can do, if we want to just view the mask on its own, we can hold down Alt and we can click on this mask icon. And then what Substance Painter does is that it flips the viewport over to that mask view. Now this is going to be a lot more helpful. So with this 3D Voronoi fractal enabled, we can have a look at some of these settings over here. And much like with many of the generators and smart masks and all of that, there's just no real template that you can kind of follow with all these different values. You've really just got to play with these sliders until such time as you find something that gets closer to what it is that you're looking to create. So what I'm wanting to create is a wooden pattern in that I want to emulate those long streaks that you find with wood. It's something that could have been sculpted in, but better that you rather do it with texturing, and then that way it can remain more flexible. So let's start by trying to just get these streak patterns down. And what I want to do is I want to start by coming here to where it says size, and I just want to drag these sliders down until they're quite low. I don't want to zero them out. I want to keep them with a bit of a value, but I'm going to make it really low, something like 0.1. And I'm going to do the same thing for this one over here as well, which is the size Z. I'm also just going to drag this down and make this something like 0.1. And as soon as we do this, we can start to see that we're getting this nice sort of streaky pattern that's appearing. But note how just above this, we also have a scale. Now this scale, this is like a global multiplier, okay? So what the scale does is that it's either going to take all three of these and multiply it by this amount to either make it bigger, or we could go the opposite way, and we could make it smaller. But making it smaller is not something that we obviously want, because now this becomes so large that we can't actually see anything. So I actually thought that where we had it just a moment ago, that looked like a pretty good spot. So I'm thinking something like anywhere from, I would say, like a value of 15 to between 20. It starts to actually look like it's pretty good. So one of the key things that I want you to notice is the fact that this pattern is not just the fact that it's getting streaky. But notice how it's not just these straight lines, but we do have a bit of this kind of natural deviation that's occurring. And that's something that we can obviously observe in things like wood quite a bit. So this is a great way of just creating that lovely amount of finer wood detail that we often see on the surface. So I think I'm kind of happy with this. I don't think we need to really adjust the balance or even the contrast. You're welcome to play with this, and you can, but I wouldn't advise that we get too dark with the contrast. So I'm actually just going to leave mine on 0. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and we're going to play a little bit around with things like disorder and distortion intensity and all of those sorts of things. So disorder is by default set to 1. If we take this and we bring this down to 0, we can see what happens. We can see that Voronoi effect, it gets rearranged at a base level in such a way that we kind of almost just getting like this kind of grid sort of pattern that starts to appear, right? So that's obviously not what we want. So disorder is really our friend in that it's creating this randomness, and that's really great. Next up, we have this distortion intensity. So if we just play around with the slider, we can see how we can further adjust this pattern, and we can obviously distort it a little bit. So, I feel it's like this is something you could leave on 0, but at the same time, why not just play around with it a little bit and see if we can find a middle ground here that maybe works quite well. So I'm just going to leave mine on this value. And once again, it's not about the value, it's about the visual. So these numbers, they mean nothing. We're just sliding these around until such time as visually we're getting a result that we're happy with. And I quite like what it's doing over here, and I quite like the natural waviness that's being created. So I feel as though this value is something that's going to work really, really well. The distortion scale multiplier, I think that pretty much speaks for itself. It's the same thing that we saw earlier with the scale value and how it affects the various channels over here, in that this is just merely a multiplier that's been applied on top of everything else. So we can increase the value if we're wanting something a little bit more dramatic, but otherwise we can also just leave this on the default value. I don't feel as though it's really contributing all that much. So I'm just going to leave that scale intensity on 1. Then next up, we have the minimum and maximum levels. So, basically what is this? This is a way of clamping textures, and clamping involves looking at the highest and lowest values of any incoming data, and then quite literally clamping that. So think of it like a concertina effect. Data can be pushed in and squeezed together, or it can be elongated. So with something like a minimum level, if we start to increase this, look at the effect that's having over here, right? Now, understanding what that's doing on a math level is irrelevant. The most important thing is to, once again, just focus on the visual. And I'll say that this minimum value and making this adjustment, particularly above 0, definitely starts to create a very nice effect here. So something like 1 or maybe even 2 could work really well. I'm kind of more sort of persuaded to go with 1. I like this effect a little bit more, so I'm just going to leave it on that. And then the max level is pretty much the same thing, but it's once again, it's a case of just finding the value that visually gives the best result. I'm going to leave mine on 4. I don't see any reason to actually make any adjustment there. The roughness in terms of this particular Voronoi, roughness does not relate to roughness on a material level. This is just a duplicated term that's been used to describe the Voronoi pattern itself. And you can see that roughness is quite literally adding more breakup to that pattern. And I think the default value was on about 0.5. I actually think we could probably increase this just slightly, maybe to 0.6, and that starts to look really good, actually. So I'm pretty happy with that. And then finally, I think the last one that's maybe worth just looking at is this distance scale. I should rather say, I was about to say distortion scale, but it's actually distance scale. We can take this and we can adjust this if we like. Notice we turn it down to 0. then things start to get really wonky. Its default setting is on 1. If we had to take it down to something like 0 0.7 or 0 0.8, it's not bad. It's almost like it's introducing a little bit of contrast. What I'm just a bit wary of is that I don't want to get too dark in some of these areas, right? So I think I want to I do want to adjust it. I just don't want to adjust it that much. Okay, so I'm going to leave it on something like maybe 0 0.83. Okay, so once that's done, what we're going to do is we can add a little something here. And I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to say add a filter, because what I'm looking for is something called a high pass filter. So I'm going to type in high, and we want to grab that curious looking icon over there. That's the high pass, right? So what this high pass is doing, as you can see, is that it is making a further adjustment to this output. And the kind of adjustment that it makes is very similar to what I was referring to moments ago, in terms of there being like a clamp of some sorts that starts to occur. So reason why I like to use the high pass is because what it does is that it tends to just lift some of these darker values so that it doesn't get too dark, right? So with this high pass, we can adjust this thing over here called a radius, and that affects the way that it processes the information. So this default value of 3 is actually not too bad, but we can take this, and you'll notice that if you slide it all the way to the right hand side, you get a little bit more of a dramatic result. You slide it all the way to the left, and notice how you just get pure gray, because that's what happens when something is severely clamped. In that, once again, imagine like a concertina. You're bringing two sides in, and where those two sides meet is at the middle point. And what is the middle point between 0 and 1? Well, it's a mid-gray. So that's what you're seeing here at the moment. So I'm going to take this, and I'm maybe just going to take it to a value of something like maybe 5. That looks like it's pretty good. And then finally, what we can do, because I think we kind of done creating this nice effect over here, is that we can right click on this, and I want to add this thing called an anchor point. Okay, let's go ahead and let's give this anchor point a name. It by default wants to be called wood texture, but wood texture is really the name of the layer right over here. So what I want to do instead is I maybe just want to end it off with a capital A and a capital P. That's my way of being able to easily recognize that that is indeed an anchor point. All right, so let me just create a bit of space here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this anchor point, and I'm actually going to drag it. I'm going to pop it down here at the bottom of the stack. So that way it's actually not affecting anything. We don't see it at all. Now the reason for that goes back to what I was explaining about what an anchor point actually is that it's information. It's a little network that can be called in at various parts of your layer stack itself. Okay, so it's almost irrelevant where it sits. I say almost because it depends on how the anchor point is being created and what network it's attributed to. But in this case, this doesn't need to be created above the base texture. It can sit below it, and we are just merely going to call it in whenever we need it. All right, so to make a little bit more sense of what we are actually doing here, I want to create a folder. I'm going to call this base color. And I guess in many ways, this is going to be a base color and a texture, which is why I often will just call something base most of the time. Okay, I'm going to take this base color and I'm going to drop it into the folder like so. And then what I want to do is I want to create another layer. Okay, so let's go ahead and create another fill. And for this one, we can call this base texture. But now what we're going to do is we're not going to bother to, to try to create different colors and that sort of thing. Instead now, we're going to start using our anchor point. So if we click on base color, we can go ahead and you will see here at the very top, you'll see that there's resources, but then just to the right of that is anchor points. Click on anchor points. This is so far a list of all the anchor points that I have. Now we've only created one. So it's just this wood texture AP. So I'm going to select that. And notice what that's done. That has now called in this wood texture over here. It has now called it into this layer right over here. All right. So we're getting this overlay. And I refer to it as an overlay deliberately because making sure that I'm on the base color channel, I now want to change my layer blend mode to overlay. And you can see I'm getting some of that kind of like natural color variation that's now starting to make an appearance. Okay. We can obviously adjust this, but I'm not going to adjust this just yet. I'm going to leave it for now because I want us to call in some other channels. And by other channels, what I mean is that under this base texture, I don't just want color. What I'm also wanting is things like height. Okay. Now, when I enable height, height's not going to show any difference. But as soon as I do the same thing that I did for color over here by clicking on that and coming here to anchor points and then doing that, well, now we're getting this really nice detail that's coming through. It is incredibly harsh though. So we're going to want to bring this down. Now, be very careful with this next bit because this is where Substance Painter can get a little bit confusing. You need to be aware of what channel it is that you're currently on. Now notice under layers, we are actually on base color. The other thing that I want to point out to you is that you cannot use your viewport as a way of being sure of what channel the layers is currently set to. Because if I hit the C key and if I view my height channel over here, I might be viewing it through the viewport, but my layers over here is actually pointing towards my base color. So I have to change this to height. All right. Notice how this and this are independent from each other. Okay. Very important. Catches a lot of people out in the beginning. And, you know, not surprised that it would, because it's one of those things that it does just feel a bit counterintuitive. So with the height channel now being viewed here in the layers, I'm going to change the layer blending mode. I'm going to take it down to something that's way more subtle. You really do need to be subtle when it comes to things like height. It's very like amateur in that when you see a lot of artists, they set the height channel to be something very like overly dramatic. Height should always, most of the time should always be very subtle, and it's how you build it up that really creates, the best effect. So I'm thinking something along this value, which you can see over here. Mine is currently set to 14. I think that should actually work pretty well. All right, can hover around just to really inspect it. And what I'm looking for is that I'm not just looking, I'm looking to see the actual details, that they're coming through, but that they don't feel over exaggerated at the same time. All right, and this is feeling like it's in a decent spot. I could be wrong. We might have to go back and adjust after the fact, but for now, this feels like it's in a decent spot. Okay. So I think what we can then do is we can also just enable the roughness channel. And then this roughness channel, we're going to do the same thing. Let's grab this anchor point. And this actually feels fine. I quite like the fact that it's adding as much variation as what it is. That's nice. Like, that's actually really nice. I'm viewing the roughness channel at the moment. I love the fact that it's going between these lighter values and these darker values in the way that it is. If you want to adjust it, you can just head on over to the roughness layer, and then you can go ahead and you can adjust it here. But this actually feels pretty good for now. Once again, it could change in the future, but for now, this is actually feeling all right. Cool. All right. So that's the base layer that we've cracked on with. I think what is going to be a good one to tackle now, so long, is also a bit of ambient occlusion, because that ambient occlusion helps us just to visualize things easier. All right. So for this one, I want to go ahead and create a full layer, and we can call this dirt, or you can call it AO. Really makes no real difference. And I'm going to start by making it something that's like very noticeable. So I'm just going to make it black. This is obviously not what I'm wanting as a final result. But in the meantime, I'm just going to add a black mask. And then what I'm looking for this black mask is, if we look under our smart masks over here, which I think, here we go. What I'm looking for is a smart mask. It's called, I think it's dirt cavities, or dust occlusion rather. I think this one actually works a bit better. If we just hover over it, you can see the effect that this creates. And you know, if you want to compare it to maybe dirt cavities was the other one that just sort of caught my eye. There we go. You know, you can see that, you know, it's some differences, but they are both generally achieving the same thing. So I think I'm just going to stick with this dust occlusion. So I'm going to click it here, and I'm just going to drag it, and I'm going to drop it onto the mask over there, and you're going to see that that has now automatically been added. And immediately you can see this is creating a very harsh, very overkill in terms of the darkening of all these details. But what is nice is that we immediately have got this the start of a more interesting kind of separation that's happening between the various objects, and it's definitely helping just to define a lot of these finer details a lot more. So what we really need to do is to adjust this color, because using a black like this is not something that I would ever recommend. It looks absolutely dreadful. So let's go ahead and let's click on this. And what we can do is we can grab that swatch that we saved earlier. And if I just go ahead and if I look at our base color, and if I isolate, you can see how we've now got this, appearance over here. But obviously, this is not really what we're wanting. What we're wanting is that we want this color to maybe be maybe a little bit darker, maybe also just be a little bit more saturated as well, because that is what tends to happen in areas where there's ambient occlusion. In that when a color gets darker, it's not just the fact that it's getting darker, it also just gets a bit more of like a boost in terms of how like vivid and how saturated it is. So we can play with things like our blend modes over here a bit, and we set it to something like multiply. Well, in fact, first let's make sure that we are actually on the base color channel, and then if we set it to something like multiply, then you can see that we start getting a little bit of interplay between this layer and everything below it. Now, multiply is not really something that I think is going to work very well. And in fact, the more I look, the more I feel as though none of this is actually really going to work too well. So instead, let's do this. Let's come over here to this color, and let's say, well, you know what, let's actually just maybe just darken the color a little bit. All right, let's do something like maybe something like that. Notice how when I darken the color, I don't want to darken it to the point where it's becoming black, where it's actually like losing that hue that it has. I'm just wanting it to darken it in a way that it feels like it fits and it sits with the rest of the paintwork correctly. Okay, and if we look at this from a material view, I can see that, you know, for me, this actually feels like it might be getting a little bit too dark. All right, so I don't want it that dark. Okay, I want to maybe just bring this up a bit to something like that. Maybe that feels like it's a little bit better. And if we bring this back, that's starting to feel a bit nicer now. Okay, all right, so I think this is a good place for us to end off this part of the texturing of this asset. And then in the next video, we're going to pick up with the rest of the process of texturing the wood.